House Republicans have really taken aim at the Biden administration on this, saying that they're not doing enough to prevent Russian aggression toward Ukraine and also preventing an invasion. Their response to this is the guaranteeing Ukrainian autonomy and by reinforcing its defense, or the GUARD Act. Let's take a look at that legislation right here. It would immediately bolster military weapons and training for Ukrainian armed forces, designate Ukraine as a NATO plus country, sanction the Nord Stream 2 pipeline to stop it from becoming operational, and provide congressional oversight of the Biden administration's sanctions on Russia, among other measures in that bill. But one of its authors, Congressman Mike Rogers, said, quote, "This legislation would dramatically increase funding for lethal aid to Ukraine, specifically for anti-air and anti-ship weaponry that the Ukrainians will need to deter Russia. It also makes clear that Putin's demand, such as a veto over who can join NATO and a moratorium on the deployment of intermediate-range missiles to Europe, are non-starters and run contrary to U.S. national security interests." And we know that the Pentagon on Monday ordered 8,500 troops to be on standby as possible deployment for part of the NATO response force, while Biden and European leaders continue to discuss a diplomatic solution to this crisis. But John, we were here just over a week ago talking about the fate of Texas Senator Ted Cruz's Nord Stream 2 sanctions bill, which failed that 60-vote threshold in the Senate, only getting 5 Democrats on board. So it's really unclear at this point whether they're going to have support from their Democratic colleagues in this chamber to get something done here.
Yeah, really head-scratching there with the Cruz thing, because, Kilmini, you think this would be a great opportunity for the U.S. to send a unified message to NATO and to Russia that they are standing together. Didn't happen, though, as you reported. Thank you for your report, Kilmini Dukar, for us live on Capitol Hill. All right, let's break all this down now with Mark Halperin, host of the Mark Halperin Focus Group. Catch it weekends right here on Newsmax. Also with us, former Trump advisor Sam Nunberg. Gentlemen, great to have you with us.
Good to see you, John Bachman Now.
Mark Halperin Focus Group. We need to get Sam Nunberg some kind of self-titled show. But let's talk about the politics of this. And, you know, we're putting troops on ready alert, Mark. We've got weapons arriving as we speak in Ukraine right now. It seems like President Biden is maybe kind of framing his whole Ukraine policy based on the failures of Afghanistan. And I wonder if that's the best move.
Well, there's no doubt that the specter of that haunts the president and his political advisors, and to some extent his national security team. There's also no doubt that we see a little bit of concern, rightfully so, about Americans who could potentially be left behind in Ukraine if there is a war. That is something, of course, the U.S. mission failed in Afghanistan. And finally, you're seeing a country that Joe Biden thinks he knows well, has a long record with. But as we saw with Afghanistan, as we saw with some of the other Joe Biden's past decisions on foreign policy, familiarity does not necessarily breed expertise.
No, that is not apparent here in this case. And, you know, Ukraine is not, you know, the cleanest country when it comes to their government, Sam. There's a long history of corruption there. And, you know, I wonder if Joe Biden's made things worse here based on his previous experience. What do you think is really framing his decisions here?
Well, I don't think that Joe Biden walked in as president happy with President Zelensky of Ukraine. If you recall, during the Trump impeachment, which should not have happened, Zelensky took a extremely neutral role. He did not go out of his way. He did not have anybody in his government defend Biden. Now, as we know, Biden's son received $80,000 a month from Burisma while Biden was VP, and then was still receiving $40,000 a month. But then the spigot was cut off. And I do think that one of the reasons that Biden is willing to just in a press conference just say, well, you know, Russia, you can take a little of Ukraine, is because of his diminished respect for President Zelensky, and that diminished respect is out of self-interest. This is one of the most corrupt people I've ever seen in politics. And I'll tell you something, this has been known for many, many years. He's been running some kind of syndicate with his son and his brother. And these are millions and millions of dollars. I would tell the audience that I hope you have on Peter Schweitzer, because I've seen what's going to be in that book about Biden. There's more about Ukraine. There's more about China. And he has a lot of money that hasn't been reported. And I would also tell you, too, I'm a tax attorney. I practice tax law. You know, Hunter Biden is running one of the great money laundering schemes I've ever seen. He has this paint by numbers, these paintings, they're terrible, and he's getting hundreds of thousands to millions.
Sam, you mentioned that, and I don't want to get too much into this because we talked about this previously. The White House actually issuing a statement on the pitfalls of the art industry for corruption, so you bring that up. But I want to get to Mark real quickly on this. I mean, how important is this in terms of the story right now, Hunter Biden's involvement and what Joe Biden's history is in Ukraine, the stuff Sam brings up? Is it important to talk about that at this stage of the game, Mark?
Well, I think it's important for a couple of reasons. First of all, as far as we know, he's still under federal criminal investigation, not necessarily for these exact activities, but for his business dealings. I think if this were a Republican president, there'd be a lot more interest in that in some portions of the media. And obviously, Joe Biden's history with this country is pretty long and detailed, and some of it does involve his son. And again, if you look at Donald Trump and speculation and coverage of his history with these countries, that was fair game and sometimes overstated. That should be and justifiably looked at here as well.
Yeah, a lot of important decisions to be made. It would be nice to have all the facts while these decisions are being made. So let's leave this aside. I want to talk a little bit more about Biden snapping yesterday. This is the latest example of him doing that. And Mark, you are hearing from some of your sources that his handlers are nervous about him even meeting with members of his own party in Congress because apparently he's snapping at everyone.
Had heated conversations with some members of Congress and with his staff. Now, look, this is not brand new. Anyone who's covered Joe Biden, followed Joe Biden, worked for Joe Biden knows that he's always had a temper. He is prone to snap at people. He's done it in public throughout his political career. And it's happening now to such an extent that, yes, as you said, there are some people around him who are uncomfortable putting him in certain situations for fear that he will behave in a way that will not advance his interests or the White House's interests. And that is another limiting factor of the current state of Joe Biden's ability to perform.
Not new, but the question I think some of us have too, Sam, is it getting worse? Is this a sign of something else?
You know, I don't think that yesterday showed it's getting worse. Look, Joe Biden was always a bully before it was unfashionable with Donald Trump. If you read Mark's book about the 2012 election, one of the quotes in there is about how Biden saying he knew the campaign was in a lot of trouble because they were telling him to be himself against Paul Ryan. This is not a nice guy. This is that was put up. They made him up as if he's empathetic. Somebody I know that worked for him said he's only empathetic about himself. And I think you saw that when you had our Marines come home, those 13 Marines that should not have been killed. And he's just talking about his son, Bo, who really is not a gold star.
Right. This is something, Mark and I had the same conversation, Sam, about how he makes everything about himself and sometimes at the worst possible times, as you just indicated. All right, gentlemen, we got 3 minutes left, and I want to talk about this topic, kind of the favorite parlor game so far of the early election process. And I'm talking about 2024 now. There's a new poll out which shows Donald Trump leading potential GOP rival, and I say that with a bit of jest, Ron DeSantis. He's in distant second. But I wanted to get everyone's take on this. There seems to be a lot of folks in the media are girding for this battle between Trump and DeSantis. How real is it at this point? Is there any real rivalry here to talk about?
I don't think there will be a real rivalry if Donald Trump decides to run, and I think he will, because the press likes to look for little chinks here. But his hold on the party, on the nominating electorate, is still quite strong. Ron DeSantis has had a good year, 2 years politically with parts of the country, but I don't think he currently is as formidable in the minds of the donor class or the elected officials as he was even 6 months or a year ago. So DeSantis is clearly number two, and I think that's a remarkable achievement for a guy who was unknown a few years ago. But right now, it would be silly to forecast that they will have any sort of face-off.
Well, you know what they say about number two, Sam? It's the first loser. At least maybe that's what they say in some NASCAR movie. But, you know, is this a real rivalry, Sam?
Yeah, I'm going to disagree with Mark. Look, that Harvard-Harris poll that came out last weekend, it wasn't a good sign for Donald Trump. I'll tell you why. The worst part that Donald Trump's biggest enemy here is time. He's already been at his ceiling. He started in the 70s in these primaries. The last poll taken by Harvard-Harris, he was at 67. Now he's in the 50s. You had a poll by NBC that came out, and for the first time, you had 56% of Republican respondents saying that they're members of the Republican Party. If I was working for Donald Trump, and Donald Trump's a very, very smart man, he knows this. That's why he's bickering about DeSantis. DeSantis will often tell donors he has raised a lot of money. I think he has the largest war chest of any governor. Look, we need to look to the future. we can't look to the past. I was at a ZOA dinner. He came in 2019 telling everyone he was going to run for president in 2024 against Pence. He's very ambitious. What happens, and I'd like to hear Mark's take here, what happens if DeSantis has a 8 to 12-point victory? I'm sitting here in Florida. I think he could. Donald Trump loses a bunch of these endorsements. Some of these endorsements don't make any sense to me. It's sometimes some things get hot. Once again, Donald Trump his worst fear is the time issue. He's already started at his ceiling, and people could be looking for something fresh. Iowa is going to be competitive for Trump.
All right,
He's
well,
not going to have.
I just got 30 seconds here. Let's let Mark weigh in on that and answer.
Sam, I literally agree with everything you said. I listened closely, sentence by sentence, and I agree. Trump is diminished of where he was. There's no doubt about it. But he's gone from a 1,200-pound gorilla to an 800-pound gorilla. Still the biggest gorilla in the party. And I just don't see Ron DeSantis, even with a big reelection win, which I expect he'll have, and having raised all that money, I just don't see him being a formidable challenger. If Donald Trump is in fighting shape, if he's not by medical or legal problems, if he's not hampered in some way, I just don't see the prospect of somebody beating him for the nomination.
And he looks pretty good, and at least that's what the comments said in the selfie we took last week in Phoenix. Gentlemen, great to see you both. We'll talk soon.
Good to see you, Sam. Good to see you.